So hello friends, my name is Nikhil, and today I'm going to tell you a story which will make you think. So let's start. Boulder, Colorado, December 1996. The city was quiet in the aftermath of Christmas, wrapped in cold winter air and the soft stillness that usually follows a holiday morning. Inside one of its most well-known neighborhoods stood the Ramsey family home, a large, well-kept house that looked peaceful from the outside, almost untouched by anything dark. 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was known across local pageant circles as a bright, confident child. She had a strong stage presence for her age, a charming smile, and a personality that made her stand out wherever she went. To many, she represented innocence, discipline, and childhood glamour wrapped into one. But that morning, something felt different inside the house. According to Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother, she woke up and noticed something unusual on the back staircase. It was a handwritten note, not a short message, not a quick demand, but a long, carefully written ransom note left inside the house. The contents were disturbing in their precision. The writer demanded exactly $118,000 in exchange for JonBenét's safe return. The amount immediately drew attention later, not just because it was specific, but because it closely matched a bonus John Ramsey had received from his company that year. At the time, however, the family was thrown into panic rather than analysis. The note itself was strange in tone as well, formal, almost theatrical in places, as if the writer was trying too hard to sound like a professional criminal. It spoke of surveillance, threats, and instructions, yet it was left inside the house instead of being delivered or communicated in any normal way. That contradiction would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Inside the home, fear quickly replaced confusion. The Ramseys began searching the house, calling out JonBenét's name, moving from room to room, trying to make sense of what they had just found. Every second that passed made the situation feel more urgent, more unreal. John Ramsey eventually made his way down to the basement. The air there was colder, heavier, filled with silence that didn't match the panic upstairs. He opened doors, checked storage areas, moving deeper into the lower level of the house. Then he reached a small, windowless room used for storage. Inside, he discovered something that would forever define this case. JonBenét's body was there, hidden away beneath a white blanket. The discovery ended any possibility of a kidnapping in progress and immediately transformed the situation into a homicide investigation. The house that had moments earlier been filled with confusion and hope became the center of a crime scene that investigators would struggle to fully understand for decades. Police were called immediately, and within hours the home was sealed off. What should have been a routine post-Christmas morning had turned into one of the most disturbing and complex child murder investigations in American history. And as investigators began to arrive, one question already hung heavily in the air. Was the ransom note real, or was it part of something far more personal and far more disturbing than a kidnapping gone wrong?
In the hours and days that followed, the investigation into the death of JonBenét Ramsey began to unravel under pressure, not just from the crime itself, but how the early response was handled. One of the first major issues was the condition of the crime scene. The Ramsey home in Boulder had not been secured immediately in the way modern homicide investigations typically require. Before law enforcement fully established control, several family friends and acquaintances were allowed inside the house. Some moved through rooms, touched surfaces, and even attempted to comfort the family. In hindsight, this became a critical failure point. Any potential forensic traces, footprints, fibers, touch DNA, were now potentially compromised or lost forever. Investigators arriving later were confronted by a chaotic environment. Instead of a sealed, untouched scene, they found a home that had already been walked through, disturbed, and emotionally processed by multiple people. Every open doorway, every moved object introduced uncertainty into what should have been a carefully preserved investigation. As forensic analysis slowly progressed, the autopsy results added a far more disturbing layer to the case. The examination confirmed that JonBenét had died from a combination of strangulation and a severe skull fracture. The head injury was powerful enough to suggest a significant blunt force impact, while the strangulation indicated sustained pressure applied to the neck. The combination of both injuries suggested a prolonged and violent assault rather than a single moment of accidental harm. Inside the house, investigators found no clear signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no forced doors, no obvious points of intrusion. This detail became one of the most critical turning points in the early direction of the case. If an outsider had entered, how had they done so without leaving clear physical evidence of breaking in? Because of this absence, suspicion gradually shifted inward. Without a clear external perpetrator, law enforcement began to focus closely on those inside the home that night, Patsy Ramsey and John Ramsey. They were not formally charged, but the tone of the investigation changed noticeably. Every interview, every statement, every timeline detail was examined with heightened scrutiny. The parents became central figures in the unfolding theory that the crime may have originated inside the household rather than outside it. At the same time, the case exploded beyond the walls of the investigation. The media attention was immediate and relentless. National tabloids and television networks descended on Boulder, turning the tragedy into a constant news cycle. Images of JonBenét in her pageant dresses were broadcast repeatedly, often without restraint, transforming a private family loss into a public spectacle. The coverage was unlike anything seen before in a child homicide case. Every new detail, no matter how small or unverified, was amplified across headlines. Theories multiplied daily. Speculation filled the gaps where facts were still missing. The case was no longer only a police investigation, it had become a national obsession. And as pressure mounted from both investigators and the public, the central mystery only deepened. How could a child be taken and killed inside a home that showed no clear signs of intrusion, and why did every clue seem to point in conflicting directions?
As the investigation into the death of JonBenét Ramsey continued, the focus shifted from physical evidence to behavior, interpretation, and competing narratives, each side trying to make sense of a crime that refused to fit a single clear explanation. One of the earliest battlegrounds became the ransom note. Handwriting experts were brought in to analyze the long, unusually detailed message left inside the Ramsey home. The results, however, were far from conclusive. Some analysts pointed out similarities between the handwriting and that of Patsy Ramsey, while others strongly disagreed, stating that the sample size was insufficient or that the writing characteristics were too generic to confidently match any one person. What made the note even more confusing was its tone. It was not just a simple demand for money, it was theatrical, overly detailed, and strangely structured. The language shifted between threatening and almost performative, as if the writer was trying to imitate what a movie-style kidnapper might sound like, rather than communicating in a practical way. Investigators and analysts alike struggled to understand why a real abductor would take the time to write something so long and elaborate inside the victim's own home. Parallel to this, attention turned toward a crucial piece of recorded evidence, the 911 call made by Patsy Ramsey. Audio analysts and behavioral experts studied the call repeatedly. Critics argued that her voice sounded controlled in certain moments, suggesting possible emotional restraint or even rehearsed calmness under pressure. Some pointed to pauses, tone shifts, and background sounds as suspicious indicators. However, other experts and supporters of the Ramsey family strongly disagreed with these interpretations. They argued that expecting perfectly natural panic behavior from a mother who may have just discovered her child missing or possibly already harmed was unrealistic. They emphasized that extreme trauma can cause unpredictable reactions, including shock, confusion, and emotional numbness. In their view, interpreting tone as evidence of guilt risked turning subjective emotion into forensic proof. Through all of this, the Ramsey family consistently maintained their innocence. John Ramsey and Patsy both insisted that an unknown intruder had entered the home during the night, committed the crime, and deliberately staged the scene by leaving the ransom note behind. They described the event as a terrifying invasion by someone outside their family, someone who understood how to manipulate fear and mislead investigators. Their theory pointed to a break-in scenario, and investigators did find something that initially appeared to support this possibility: a broken basement window. From the Ramsey perspective, this window could have been the entry point used by an intruder. It was located in the lower level of the house, less visible, and could theoretically allow access without going through the main entrances. However, law enforcement remained skeptical. Upon closer inspection, the window did not show clear signs of recent forced entry. There were questions about the condition of the glass, the surrounding frame, and whether it had actually been used during the night in question or had been broken earlier and simply overlooked or ignored. This disagreement over the window became symbolic of the entire case. To one side, it represented a possible overlooked path for an outsider. To the other, it looked like an explanation that did not fully align with the physical and forensic timeline. As competing interpretations piled up, the ransom note, the 911 call, the window, and the lack of definitive external evidence, the investigation became less about a single clear trail and more about conflicting possibilities. Each clue seemed to support one theory while simultaneously weakening another. And with no consensus forming, the case moved further into uncertainty, where evidence, interpretation, and suspicion began to overlap in ways that made the truth harder, not easier, to define.
As the investigation into the death of JonBenét Ramsey stretched into years, the case began to shift from an active homicide investigation into a long-running national controversy, one defined as much by forensic uncertainty as by public debate. One of the most significant developments came from DNA analysis. Years after the initial investigation, trace DNA discovered on JonBenét's underwear was re-examined using more advanced testing methods. The results indicated that the DNA did not match any member of the immediate Ramsey family, including John Ramsey or Patsy Ramsey. This finding immediately reignited the possibility of an outside perpetrator. For supporters of the intruder theory, the DNA evidence became a critical piece of support, suggesting that someone other than the family may have been present during or after the crime. However, even this development was not straightforward. Investigators and critics debated the source, meaning, and evidentiary weight of the DNA, emphasizing that trace samples can sometimes be transferred in ways that do not directly identify a killer. At the same time, the investigation itself began to face increasing scrutiny within the law enforcement community. The handling of the case by the Boulder Police Department became a subject of controversy, with accusations of mismanagement, poor coordination, and missed investigative opportunities. Some critics argued that early mistakes, especially the failure to properly secure the crime scene, had permanently weakened the case. Others pointed to communication breakdowns between agencies and inconsistent investigative strategies as additional factors that complicated progress. These internal conflicts created a fragmented investigative environment where different interpretations of the same evidence often coexisted without resolution. In 1999, a grand jury was convened to review the case and determine whether criminal charges should be brought. The proceedings examined evidence, testimony, and competing theories surrounding the death of JonBenét. However, despite months of review, the grand jury ultimately did not reach a definitive conclusion that would support indicting anyone for the murder. The case remained legally unresolved, no formal charges filed. As years passed, the public perception of the Ramsey family began to evolve also. Early suspicion and intense media scrutiny slowly gave way, in some circles, to increased sympathy. This shift was influenced in part by a series of high-profile interviews in which the Ramseys spoke publicly, repeatedly and firmly denying any involvement in their daughter's death. John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey both presented themselves as grieving parents who believed the truth had not yet been uncovered. These appearances did not end the debate, but they did alter its tone. For some members of the public, the emotional weight of the family's grief and their consistent claims of innocence made the idea of their involvement harder to accept. For others, the unanswered questions surrounding the case meant suspicion never fully disappeared. By the end of this period, the investigation had reached an unusual state. No conclusive indictment, no universally accepted theory, and no final resolution. Instead, the case had become a long-standing conflict between forensic ambiguity, legal limits, and public interpretation, each side still trying to explain what happened inside that Boulder home on a winter morning in 1996.
After years of relentless public attention and unanswered questions, the case of JonBenét Ramsey eventually moved out of active investigation headlines, but it never truly faded from public memory. In 2006, Patsy Ramsey passed away from ovarian cancer. Her death marked the end of one of the most scrutinized lives connected to the case. She had spent her final years under the shadow of ongoing suspicion, as she was never officially cleared by investigators during her lifetime. That unresolved status followed her to the end, leaving a lingering sense of ambiguity around her role in the case, despite no formal charges ever being brought. By that time, the investigation itself had already entered a new phase. Advances in forensic science, especially DNA technology, continued to evolve rapidly. With the rise of modern techniques, including genetic genealogy databases, renewed discussions emerged about whether the evidence from the crime scene could be re-examined in a more advanced scientific framework. Supporters of this approach argued that even small or degraded DNA samples, like those collected years earlier, might now be traceable to broader familial lines using public ancestry databases. In theory, this could help identify potential suspects who were previously impossible to locate through traditional investigative methods. As a result, calls for reopening or reanalyzing the evidence periodically resurfaced, especially when similar techniques solved other cold cases in the United States. Despite these developments, the case of JonBenét Ramsey remained officially unsolved. No suspect has ever been definitively charged or convicted, and no single theory has been universally accepted by investigators or the public. Over time, the case has continued to exist in a state of permanent uncertainty. Competing explanations remain: an intruder breaking into the home, a crime linked to internal family circumstances, or a scenario that still has not been fully understood due to lost or contaminated evidence. Each theory has arguments in its favor, but none have been proven beyond doubt. The broader impact of the case extends far beyond the investigation itself. It fundamentally changed how the world views child beauty pageants, pushing them into ethical debate and public scrutiny due to the intense focus on JonBenét's pageant life. It also reshaped modern true crime reporting, becoming one of the earliest examples of a case where media coverage, public speculation, and investigative uncertainty became deeply intertwined. The constant circulation of theories, images, and analysis turned the case into a global reference point for unresolved crime storytelling, where fact and speculation often blurred in the public imagination. Today, the story of JonBenét Ramsey remains a haunting reminder of a life cut tragically short and a justice process that, despite decades of effort, has never delivered a definitive answer. The question of what truly happened inside that Boulder home in December 1996 still stands open, unchanged by time and unresolved by evidence.